Mike is a host now, so he can kick us all off.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to the September 27th Gateway API meeting. This is at 8 a.m. Pacific time. As always, the Kubernetes Code of Conduct rules are in effect. So please treat each other respectfully and feel free to add your name to the attendees list so we can keep track of who's able to make it to these meetings. And if you have anything that you'd like to talk about, it's an open agenda, so please feel free to add anything to the meeting notes section. And yeah, so I guess we wanted to kind of kick this off with a summary of what happened during last week's Gateway API meeting for folks who, I think most folks were able to attend that one, but if you missed it, please, it is well worth your time to check out the recording. I guess, presented the GEP proposal for HTTP root mesh binding. So this is kind of our first substantial UX for how we might hope to actually get Gamma implementable is kind of going to be the goal for that. So there were many good questions during that meeting that came up. If you have questions, there's definitely a chance that somebody else has already thought of them and already asked them during that meeting. So it is well worth checking that out. But kind of what is the current status now is I am working on updating this proposal and am going to move it to a formal GEP and open the PR, and with the intent of presenting it to the broader Gateway API meeting next Monday. So that would be October 3rd is the plan for that. And yeah, I guess the TLDR is it's proposing to advance the direct binding from HTTP root to Kubernetes service approach. There's several other approaches that were documented as alternative ideas in there. But that's the one that we felt made the most sense given the trade-offs and would be the most direct for understanding specifically the transparent proxy functionality and making that a clear UX for users. And yes, I believe, Austin, the one or more paragraph. I'm working with John on some of the specific semantics, but I believe it will closely correspond to something like that. Yes. I'm good. I'm working on New York. So with that, are there questions that any folks have on that proposal or kind of next steps or other topics that folks were interested in talking about? I know that Keith kind of wrapped up the meeting last week with kind of an open invitation to consider what we should move to next, because there's a vast scope of service mesh functionality, and it would be great to have some ideas about where we should go from here.
Well, I'll ask again if there's anything I can help with in terms of that GEP preparation. The GEP is going to cover the traffic splitting case, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The existing GEP is planned to cover the traffic splitting case. Yes.
Yeah, it's a little tough for me to suggest the next thing we should cover until knowing which things are going to be in that one, right?
Sure.
Timeouts and retries come immediately to mind, but that's, policy-ish stuff. One of the other things that we're wrestling a little bit with over on the Buoyant side of the world with Linkerd is the distinction between client-side policy and server-side policy, where that ends up being pretty meaningful in our world. And so that may be something that is worth talking about maybe next time. But I don't know that I have
maybe I'm feeling ambitious because we made some small agreement. But it almost feels like that's like a good thing to actually tackle next. Authorization policy, I think, is important, and it tackles that problem, so that could be a place to go.
Authorization still feels a lot more like it should be on the side of the, the producer rather than the consumer of the service. But
oh yeah, I guess why I was thinking that was that a routing policy is typically made by the producer, but in sidecar case, it applies on the consumer proxies.
Yeah.
And then there's also policy that's strictly consumer side, and then there's OTC, which is strictly producer side, right? So there's kind of like
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I'd be fine either way there. OTZ might actually make a little more sense to tackle first, because I feel like that might be a little bit more applicable to every mesh out there always 100% of the time. And so let's tackle that one next. That'll be fun. Or something.
Yeah, I was also planning not for like a different policy type, which I think adds more, but for routes specifically to have consumer oriented routes. I am planning like an addition to Mike's proposal. So, but we can do that in parallel. I think we don't need to, only do one thing at a time. I don't think it's that big of a can of worms. Like the implementation is kind of obvious once we already have this, as long as we agree that we should do it that way. It may be controversial, I think, but I don't think there'll be, a lot of work in deciding what it should be once we kind of have this baseline, which is why I'm super happy that we've at least gotten to this point, right?
Yeah.
But I would say that authorization policy and a few other things probably would be better discussed in common with the gateway API, because authorization, it's, for example, is super important for gateways as well. And again, last gateway meeting was also very interesting about and overlapping with what we've been discussing about service binding or attaching policies like backend policies and other things. So we have our own view of the world compared with gateway API, but many of those things will definitely need to be shared between them. Yeah, almost everything left is common. So we need to, but we have different perspective, because authorization policy on a service is slightly different than authorization service. It doesn't have to be as complicated as an authorization service in a gateway. We have different.
Yeah, definitely agree that we should work on it together and make sure that we're clear about this ambiguity, like where it makes sense to like use things that may already exist, like reference grant, or where those things may need to be extended to add like L7 policy support, or where places like policy attachment or something like that may make more sense. So yeah, definitely something to work on together so that we have a consistent model across all of Gateway API. Very much agreed. And yeah, one thing that came up during the proposal for the HTTP mesh binding that I'm working on a like separate smaller gap to kind of like keep that part contained, is about how mesh and gateway routes should or should not interoperate. So there's kind of two different models there of what like, and it's more focused on like the single vendor case, where you have, say, console API gateway in front of console service mesh, or an Istio gateway in front of Istio, where routes that have traffic coming in through a gateway, whether that is automatically following Gamma mesh routing rules, or whether it should require some kind of explicit configuration. So that was a significant question that came up, and I'm planning to do a separate smaller gap just to kind of cover the various options we may have there.
So what you're thinking of is that the first gap will just be talking about how the mesh would interpret HTTP route. And then there's a separate one talking about the distinction between the mesh and egress. Okay.
Yes, exactly.
That second one is going to be fascinating.
Did we agree that gateways should respect policies defined by the mesh? Like if you have an HTTP route attached to a service that is redirecting to somewhere else, a gateway must or should or could respect the route?
I think we don't have an agreement there yet, which is kind of where I want to have this separate discussion of what should we allow, what should we encourage, what should we say
require.
Require,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe that will be the first to agree, because many implementations have both gateway and mesh, and that will cause a lot of user confusion if we don't have common approach.
Yeah, exactly. And also, are we setting up users for missed expectations for like multi-vendor deployments? So that's definitely a consideration as well.
Yeah, by the way, there is a gap on gateway about delegation or composition of routes, and that's kind of the same thing in many ways. So we should clarify to that group as well.
There's definitely some overlap with the route delegation, yes, for sure. And Costin, you had something about in chat about L4 overlap with network policy. I have noticed that too as something that feels adjacent, and and I don't know yet whether it's a good idea or not, but it feels like there's a subject area of similar concern.
It's a kind of worms. I mean, we need to kind of be consistent with the working group managing network policy and see if they extend theirs, do we duplicate, do we overlap, how they compose, this kind of stuff. I think it's important to get. I mean, it will be another big discussion like we had with this one.
And Sun, you had a question, is parent refs optional?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just catching up with this. Yeah, so my key question is whether this is optional. It wasn't clear on the document. You guys might have discussed this last week because I joined a little bit late last week.
Yeah, I don't think they're optional.
Well, it's optional in the sense of a route can have 0 or more, but unless you specify at least one, that route will not be in effect. It will not be applied to anything. It will not be configuring anything. I don't know if like the webhook like rejects things that have 0 paragraphs specified, but like in practice, you should typically have at least one, I think.
Yeah, I guess the main reason I'm asking is in your example, you have service pool as backend refs, right? So in this simple scenario, almost feel the parent ref is a little bit redundant because it's same as the backend ref.
Oh, I have 2 comments about that. So one, I agree with you, but it should be the other way around. It should be if you have a parent ref, you don't necessarily need a backend ref. If we're going to add the
could be, yeah. I'm just a little bit worried about redundancy because putting stuff into place is very error prone. Yeah, it could be either way,
I would also say though that's how it works in Istio. It's in 2 places. It's not terrible, but it's but the other point is there's other reasons to not have a parent ref, which is if I want to say something like all traffic to port 80 or all traffic with, I don't know, all post requests. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but just an example. I think that's something that's useful. More common would be like traffic with hostname google.com or something. Do something else with it. I'm planning to add kind of like a advanced mesh follow-up gap to Mike's initial one with the more controversial stuff like that. That is included. So I think it's useful for egress cases. But
John, in Istio, if you don't have a backend ref, what happens?
No, we don't allow that in Istio. So.
Okay. Sorry, I thought
we don't have the parent ref.
We have host name. It's essentially parent ref.
Oh yeah, it's the host name. Okay.
I'm sorry. A second ago, I thought you said that the parent ref was in practice required, but occasionally you wouldn't have a backend ref, and that I think.
I think you just misunderstood. I was saying that in Istio they're both required today, and
okay.
So it's not terrible to me to require both of them today. I mean, I do kind of like the. Just kind of nice and like, you don't have a backend ref. Like it's so simple, but it also just, it may be confusing. I don't know. I'm fine either way, but
if we wanted to, I definitely have a to-do in the document it may be possible or optional to add something where if backend refs are not specified, then traffic should flow to the typical backends, the pod selector backends of the parent ref service. That may or may not be something that is controversial, but that's, I think, the most possible path forward if there was an interest in making it less redundant.
Yeah, It seems like it's more useful the more stuff you put in a route. So if we end up putting everything like for example, in Istio, like timeout and retries and stuff are part of the route. So then it becomes fairly reasonable, right? You say parent is foo, I just add a timeout. I don't need to do any actual routing stuff. It's kind of like my one-stop shop for adding policy to a service. But if we putting all this stuff in policy attachment, they could just attach to the service directly, potentially. So it may be less useful. Like there's some stuff like adding headers and whatnot, but so I don't know. That's something to think about.
When you say routes, that maps to the rules section, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's not do this. I mean, we had enough troubles in Istio of it.
All right.
Yeah, what I would think is actually more useful is like port things, because for example, if you have a service with multiple ports and you say, my parent is service foo, and then send to foo on port 80, well, now did I accidentally redirect, I don't know, port 90 to port 80, and I didn't actually mean to. So we do have a port as parent ref where they could do the correct thing, right? They could say match port 80 on foo and send to port 80 on foo, but maybe they forgot, right? And that's kind of an easy place to make a mistake. I forget if port is optional today, but like there is the possibility of saying something like if port is not specified in the parent and it's not specified in the backend, then like use the same one or something. But then that gets tricky if they're different services. So I probably think we shouldn't do anything, but it may be useful to have at least a note, maybe just even in the end user documentation once we actually ship this, that's saying like, don't accidentally mess with ports if you didn't mean to or something, right? And, you know, that's the type of thing you could warn in a webhook to, or if we really needed to, or potentially reject if we could make port required if, I don't know. We'd have to think about it, but it's something.
I'd kind of rather not make. Yeah, I'd kind of rather not make port required, because in the simple case, if you only have one port, then why should you have to state it, right?
Yeah, it's the simple case that you can omit it. Yeah.
But so ports in a lot of ways are kind of ugly. Matej had a question in chat. Can you use named ports in the parent ref? I have no idea. I would love to know the answer to that.
Yeah, because it's something that we're thinking of using for Linkerd's policy attachment. And one of the questions that we had is, can you actually use named ports? So if the service, for example, has a named port, can you use that in the routes parent ref?
So John says that it's currently in 32, so maybe not. But yeah, maybe we could change it to an int string. That would be nice.
Yeah, we've intentionally avoided support for port name throughout the API because it adds such a mess in terms of implementation. You know, open to compelling reasons to add it, but it has been intentionally avoided so far.
Is there a 30-second summary of the mess it causes in implementation?
Yeah, so the basic idea is that port name results in a required translation of instead of a port number, which represents a single port number, a port name can represent a different port number per backend, which can be frustrating to implement.
Ew.
Yeah.
I mean, a certain amount of my reaction to that is also, why in the world would anybody do that? But yeah, they're going to do it. Yeah.
I agree with all of that. Mistakes of the past that we're trying not to propagate any further. Yeah.
Well, and you know, realistically, the reason why people would do it is that they're trying to do, in the mesh case, they're trying to do something like, you know, I don't know, A/B testing, and the B version of the service listens on a different port for whatever reason, right?
Yeah.
But we have section name. I mean, we can use section name to represent the port. I mean, I think it's a string, not.
Yeah, but we have port name as well, so it's kind of weird to use section name, right?
Oh yeah, but port is a number, and section name is a string. So if you have, I don't know, we have.
Yeah, I see what you mean. But it seems like port would just be, if we're going to do that, just make port allow a string as well, like they do in service.
I think port number, port number it's very confusing, since backend port is different than service port, and there are kind of other issues. Section name and using the port names there, or putting the name or string has other benefits in terms of flexibility.
It's definitely interesting to think about whether using the name would be easier for the user, even if it's harder for the implementers.
It's a map.
I'm honestly not sure if it would be easier or just different. I don't know. Matej, do you have any opinion there, or anybody else? In general, I'm a big fan of making things easier on the user, even when it makes it harder for the implementers, because there are fewer implementers than users. It's a win all the way around for humanity. I don't know what's easier in this case, though, for the user.
What's easier to remember, a phone number or a name?
A name.
It's a name. Yeah, that's.
Yeah. Sorry, Matej, I stomped on you. What were you going to say?
No, it's just about the same thing as Costin. I think we see a lot of people use port names, and we personally use them as well. So for example, for our admin ports, we never used a port number, we used a port name. Okay. So.
Yeah, well, all right. So I would lean towards port names, and then supporting port names and accepting that it'll make life harder for ourselves.
Well, it sounds like at the very least, that's a topic to cover in that proposal you're putting together, John. All right. It feels like we covered a fair number of options for next steps. It sounds like a few folks have proposals in progress that they're working on towards. Yeah, so I guess at this point, is there anything else that folks want to talk about on the agenda today, or should we wrap up a little bit early? I hear nothing, so yeah, I guess with that, thanks everyone for coming. Really appreciate it, and yeah, looking forward to presenting our first implementable proposal next week at the Upstream Gateway API meeting. So thanks everyone for your participation and review of the doc so far, and yeah, have a good rest of the day, y'all.
You too.
Thanks.
Thanks.